Every BMW you've ever admired, every 3 Series, every M car, every straight 6 that made you fall in love with the brand, every time BMW called itself the ultimate driving machine, all of it can be traced back to a decision that almost never happened. December 1959. BMW wasn't preparing to launch its next great car, it was preparing to disappear. The company had spent years building beautiful luxury automobiles that hardly anyone could afford. Its tiny bubble cars kept the lights on, but not for much longer. Losses were mounting, banks were losing confidence. And inside BMW's own boardroom, many executives believed there was only one realistic way forward: sell the company. The buyer waiting on the other side of the table was Mercedes-Benz. Not a partnership, not an investment, a complete takeover. If the deal went through, BMW wouldn't become a rival to Mercedes. It would become part of Mercedes. The blue and white roundel would survive, but only as another badge inside someone else's empire. On December 9th, BMW's shareholders gathered to vote. For most companies, annual shareholder meetings are little more than paperwork. For BMW, this one would decide whether the company still existed by Christmas. Then, at the last possible moment, everything changed. A major shareholder named Herbert Quandt refused to accept that BMW's story was over. Against the advice of his bankers, against the advice of BMW's own leadership, he chose to risk a fortune on something nobody else could see. Not on the cars BMW was already building, but on the company BMW could become. Rock bottom. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand exactly how far BMW had fallen, because this wasn't a company having a rough year. This was a company running out of ways to exist. Through the 1950s, BMW had bet its identity on cars like the 501 and 502. Big, handsome, technically ambitious luxury sedans nicknamed the Baroque Angels. They were the kind of cars that impressed people at auto shows. They were also cars almost nobody in post-war Germany could afford. Germany in the 1950s wasn't ready for expensive V8 luxury sedans. The middle class that would eventually define BMW's entire business didn't have that kind of money yet. So the Baroque Angels sat on lots. Production numbers stayed small, and everyone that didn't sell cost BMW more than it earned back. To survive, BMW did something almost embarrassing for a company that built aircraft engines in its past. It started building bubble cars, the Isetta, a tiny 3-wheeled microcar with a single door that opened from the front, barely big enough for 2 adults and a bag of groceries. It sold. It kept factory lines running. But a company cannot rebuild its identity or its balance sheet on a car that most competitors saw as a punchline. So by the late 1950s, BMW was stretched between 2 failing strategies at once: luxury cars too expensive for the market that existed, and economy cars too small to fund the company's future. The losses kept compounding year after year, and BMW's bankers, including some of the same banks that were also creditors to Daimler-Benz, started asking a very direct question: why keep propping up a company that can't turn a profit? Inside BMW's own management, the mood had shifted from concern to resignation. The board's own leadership, led by managing director Hans Feith, came to the shareholders not with a new product plan, but with what was in practice an ultimatum. Either BMW declared bankruptcy outright, or it accepted a takeover by Daimler-Benz and became, in effect, a supplier of car bodies for Mercedes vehicles. Not a competitor, not a partner, a subcontractor wearing its own badge for a little while longer, until even that faded. Think about what that actually meant. The company that would one day build the M1, the company that would define the sports sedan, the company whose engines would eventually power Formula One champions. All of that was one signature away from simply not happening. There was no reason in December 1959 to believe BMW was destined for greatness. Every number on every page said the opposite. This is the version of BMW almost nobody remembers, not the underdog that quietly succeeded. The company that, by every rational business measure, should have quietly ceased to exist. Consider what BMW actually had to sell going into that meeting. A tiny bubble car with a single front hinge door, a modest 700 series economy model that was doing reasonably well, but nowhere near well enough to fund a comeback on its own, and a lineup of elegant, expensive sedans that had already proven the market didn't want them. There was no obvious next move, no engineering breakthrough waiting in a drawer, no wealthy savior lined up and ready. Just a company that had run out of good options, staring at a takeover offer that would have quietly folded it into a rival's shadow, and it very nearly did. Act 2. The gamble pays off. Herbert Quant's decision to fight the Daimler-Benz takeover didn't come with a guarantee. It came with a deadline. BMW had one real shot left, one car that had to work because there wasn't a backup plan if it didn't. That car was unveiled in 1961 and reached German showrooms the following year. BMW called it the 1500. Today, collectors and historians know it by a different name. The car that started what BMW calls the Neue Klasse, the new class. At a glance, it looked like a sensible, mid-sized family sedan, because that's exactly what it needed to be. BMW couldn't afford another halo car nobody could buy. It needed something that could actually sell in volume, priced for the growing German middle class that the Baroque angels had missed entirely. But underneath that sensible shape was something the market hadn't seen before. BMW gave the 1500 a fully independent suspension. McPherson struts up front, semi-trailing arms in the rear. On paper, that's an engineering spec sheet. On the road, it meant something people could actually feel. This car didn't just ride comfortably, it handled with a kind of composure and precision that competitors in its price class simply didn't offer. Road testers at the time noticed immediately. This wasn't a car built down to a price, it was a car built up to a feeling. The sense that the machine underneath you actually wanted to be driven, not just endured. And at the heart of it was the engine BMW had built specifically for this moment. So 1.5-liter single overhead cam 4-cylinder that would come to be known as the M10. It wasn't the most powerful engine in its class, 80 horsepower by BMW's own published figures, modest even for 1962, but it was smooth. It revved eagerly, and contemporary road testers actually suspected BMW was underselling it. Road and Track's own testing hinted the real output ran closer to 90 horsepower than BMW's official number. That combination, honest handling, a willing little engine, and a price that finally matched what Germany's growing middle class could actually spend, did something the Baroque angels never managed. People bought it, in real numbers. Over the new class's production run, more than 350,000 units left BMW's factories. Not because Herbert Quant willed it into existence through sheer nerve, because BMW's engineers had built something genuinely better than what else was on the market. This is the part of the story that's easy to skip past, because a bold investor saved a struggling company makes for a tidier headline than an engineering team quietly built a better car under enormous pressure. But the second version is the true one. BMW didn't survive because Herbert Quant was lucky. It survived because the new class earned every sale it got. The gamble only worked because the car underneath it was actually good, and buried in that success, in an engine nobody expected to matter beyond this one sedan, was something the people who designed it couldn't have fully understood yet. Act 3, the engine nobody expected. Here's a strange fact about the M10. BMW built it to save a company, not to become legendary. And yet, decades later, engineers and tuners would talk about this modest 4-cylinder the way you'd talk about a piece of over-engineered military hardware. Something built far tougher than the job actually required. Start with the block itself. BMW's engineers, led by Alexander von Falkenhausen, didn't design a block that was merely adequate for 80 horsepower. They designed one with unusually thick cylinder walls and a cast iron block that had far more structural strength than a modest family sedan engine needed in 1962. At the time, nobody could point to a specific reason why that mattered. It just felt like the responsible way to build something meant to last. Then there's the bottom end. The M10 was built with a 5-main bearing crankshaft, a stouter, more rigid bottom end than many economy engines of its era bothered with. Main bearings are what keep a crankshaft stable under load. More of them, properly sized, means an engine that can handle more stress without flexing or wearing prematurely. Again, overkill for a sedan designed to carry a family to church on Sundays. The M10 was also what engineers call over-square. Its cylinder bore was wider than its stroke was long. In plain terms, that's a design that naturally allows an engine to rev higher and breathe more freely than a long-stroke design of the same era. It's a layout you'd expect from something built with performance in mind, not from something whose entire job description was keep BMW's lights on. Put those choices together: an overbuilt block, a stout 5-bearing crank, a rev-happy over-square layout, and what you actually have is an engine with enormous room to grow, room to be bored out, room to be stroked, room to handle displacement increases, forced induction, and abuse that its original designers likely never imagined. BMW hadn't set out to build a tuner's dream. They'd set out to build something that wouldn't let the company down. But those two goals, it turns out, require almost identical engineering instincts. Build in margin, don't cut corners, leave room for more than the spec sheet asks for. That headroom is exactly why, just a few years later, the same basic architecture would grow from 1.5 liters all the way up past 2.0 liters in cars like the BMW 2002, becoming one of the most beloved small sports sedans of its generation, entirely because the original M10 design had so much left in reserve. And that headroom is also the reason this engine story doesn't end with family sedans and enthusiast coupes at all, because BMW's engineers weren't the only ones who eventually noticed what this engine could take. Act 4. The escalation. The M10 was never designed to win races. It wasn't built for a podium. It was built to survive a company's darkest year in the most ordinary car BMW could put it in. That makes what happened to it next almost absurd. The first sign of what this engine could really do came with the 2002T and later the 2002 Turbo, BMW's first turbocharged production road car, unveiled in 1973. It wore an aggressive front air dam and a decal on the front spoiler that read 2002 Turbo, mirrored so the driver ahead could read it in their rearview mirror on the Autobahn. It was a statement. This modest sedan engine, when pressurized, had teeth. Around the same period, the M10 found its way into serious motorsport, European touring car racing, hill climbs, privateer efforts across the continent. Tuners and race teams kept discovering the same thing BMW's own engineers had unintentionally built in over a decade earlier. This block could take punishment that should have destroyed a family sedan engine. Then, in the late 1970s, the Brabham Formula One team, under owner Bernie Ecclestone and designer Gordon Murray, approached BMW with an idea that sounded almost reckless. Take this same basic 4-cylinder architecture, born to save a struggling German sedan maker, and turn it into a Formula One power unit. BMW's motorsport division built what became known as the M12/13, a turbocharged Formula One engine that, underneath the exotic bodywork and the fuel systems and the boost controllers, still traced its core architecture back to that same overbuilt cylinder block from 1962. By 1983, that engine was in the back of Nelson Piquet's Brabham, and Piquet won the World Championship with it, becoming the first driver to take the title with a turbocharged engine. But the number that actually stopped people in their tracks came later, in qualifying trim, where teams would run absurd levels of turbo boost for a single fast lap. Estimates on exactly how much power BMW's Turbo 4 could produce in that configuration vary, but figures commonly cited by engineers and journalists who worked with the program run past 1,300 horsepower, and some accounts push the estimate even higher. Let that sink in for a second. The same fundamental architecture, an engine designed with 80 horsepower and a family sedan in mind, pushed more than 15 times beyond its original output in a Formula One car 20 years later. BMW's engineers in 1962 weren't trying to build a legend. They were trying to build something that wouldn't quit on them. It just so happened that won't quit and can handle almost anything you throw at it turned out to be the exact same engineering philosophy. The blueprint. Here's where it's tempting to tell a simpler story than the true one, that every great BMW engine since 1962 is somehow a direct descendant of the M10. That there's a straight mechanical bloodline running from that first four-cylinder all the way to the engine in a BMW built this year. That's not actually what happened, and the true version is more interesting. The M10 wasn't copied, it didn't hand down its parts, its dimensions, or its architecture to the engines that followed. The straight-six M30 that arrived later in the 1960s was a genuinely different design. So were the M20, the M50, and every BMW engine that's come since. There is no single part you can trace unbroken from 1962 to today. What actually carried forward wasn't the engine. It was the thinking behind it. Build in more strength than the spec sheet demands. Leave room to grow rather than designing right up to the limit. Prioritize smoothness and balance over raw numbers on a brochure. Make something durable enough that an owner or a stubborn enthusiast with a wrench can push it decades past its original intention. That mindset is what actually moved forward, generation after generation, engine after entirely different engine. You can see it in the M30 straight-six that powered BMW's larger sedans through the 1970s and 80s. Overbuilt, smooth, and so durable that some examples are still running reliably with hundreds of thousands of miles behind them. You can see it again in the M20, the small, straight-six that gave 1980s 3 Series and 5 Series models their reputation for effortless, silky power delivery, a different design entirely from the M30, built for a different class of car but shaped by the same instinct to leave more in reserve than the brochure ever advertised. And you can see the same instinct today in an engine like the B58, BMW's modern, turbocharged straight-six, widely regarded by tuners and engineers as one of the most overbuilt, headroom-rich production engines currently on the market. Different metal, different decade, different technology entirely. Same philosophy. That's the actual inheritance. Not a bloodline of parts, but a blueprint of values, one that BMW's engineers have quietly redrawn, generation after generation, without ever fully abandoning the instincts that got the company through 1962 in the first place. The M10 didn't create a dynasty of descendants. It proved a philosophy worked. And BMW has been redrawing that same blueprint with new materials and new technology ever since. In December of 1959, BMW wasn't searching for a legend. It wasn't trying to build the world's fastest engine. It wasn't dreaming about Formula One championships, iconic sports sedans, or becoming one of the most respected performance brands on Earth. It was simply trying to survive. Herbert Quandt gave BMW another chance, but a second chance means very little unless you build something worthy of it. The engineers behind the new class did exactly that, not by chasing headlines, but by refusing to compromise on the fundamentals. The M10 never became important because it made extraordinary power. It became important because it was engineered with enough honesty, enough durability, and enough ambition that decades later, people were still discovering what it was capable of. From carrying families across Germany to winning a Formula One World Championship, few engines have ever traveled a road quite like it. The next time you see a BMW carve through a corner, hear one of its engines climb toward redline, or read the words, "the ultimate driving machine." Remember that none of it was inevitable. It all traces back to a company that was given one final opportunity, and to an engine that quietly made sure that opportunity wasn't wasted. Because sometimes, the most important engines aren't the ones built to make history. They're the ones built well enough to give history another chance. From all of us here at Bimmer Insider, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.